I'm a 54-year-old man, and I went through a divorce with my 48-year-old wife 8 years back. My 28-year-old daughter completely stopped communicating with me, siding with her mother, never considering my perspective on the whole situation. Although it's been almost 10 years since my divorce, it's taken me a long time to finally come to terms with how everything played out and find some measure of contentment in my current life. One reason is because my former wife did her best to ruin my character. But a bigger factor was my deep love for my daughter. Being completely excluded from her life has been more painful than anything else I've endured. Since she was already an adult back then, I couldn't be part of her life unless she wanted me to, and she seemed absolutely certain in her choice to side with her mother instead of me. I don't have much family, just my mom who had Alzheimer's, so this experience was definitely one of the most difficult things that has ever happened to me. I attempted to reach out to my daughter several times in the years following the divorce, but she was insistent on taking her mom's side and wouldn't even consider what I had to say. At one point, my ex-wife contacted me and threatened to sue me for harassment if I didn't stop trying to contact my daughter. That was pretty clear, so I stopped trying. For the past 8 years, my life has revolved around caring for my mother and advancing in my job. I've had a couple of brief romantic flings, but I find it difficult to fully put my faith in someone new since my marriage ended. That pretty much sums up the last 10 years. I understand if I sound skeptical. I'm writing this because my daughter contacted me unexpectedly after a long time. I was ecstatic and hoped that she finally realized the divorce wasn't solely my responsibility. It was especially comforting given that my mom had recently died, and I've been trying to cope with the sadness alone, really wanting some support and closeness. Therefore, my daughter got in touch with me a few months after my mother's passing. I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number, and when I answered, I heard a woman speaking. I had no idea it was my daughter. I didn't even recognize her voice because so much time had passed since our last conversation, so I was quite surprised when she told me who she was. She mentioned seeing on Facebook that her grandma had died and just wanted to see how I was doing. It really surprised me. I never knew she was keeping track of me online, and I thought that was very thoughtful. I expressed my gratitude for her call, saying I was doing okay and telling her that I missed her. We spoke for a little while, and she said that if I wanted to meet and talk in person instead of just on the phone, she'd like that. I was absolutely thrilled and agreed instantly. I planned on seeing her at my place this coming weekend. I was really looking forward to seeing her after all this time, so I'm putting these thoughts down in writing in case anyone happens to read them. I'm hoping we can rekindle our connection, or at least start getting to know each other again. My daughter came over for dinner because I wanted to cook her a meal. I felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation. The second I opened the door, I honestly didn't recognize her at all, because almost 10 years had passed since I'd last seen her, and she was just a small child back then. We started talking, and although there was some initial discomfort, I felt like we both started to loosen up after a bit. She described her current life and her job, and I did the same. After the meal, we decided it was time to confront the obvious issue that had been hanging over us. I questioned her as to why she never attempted to understand my perspective during the divorce, always automatically siding with her mother. I acknowledged that her mother was the more constant parent, since she stayed home, and at the time, I was in construction working very long days. However, I always tried my absolute best to make the time for my daughter whenever possible. She then admitted to regretting how things had played out, and that she hadn't had enough life experience to consider the situation fully, and had been influenced by how her mother presented the situation. Essentially, my former spouse portrayed me as the absolute villain who only cared about himself, and because she was never given the chance to hear my perspective, she blindly accepted whatever her mother told her. We continued our conversation, and everything seemed to be progressing smoothly until she ultimately disclosed the reason behind her visit. After we'd been chatting for quite a while, I inquired about what prompted her to contact me after all this time. She seemed slightly uneasy, and I reassured her that she could be upfront with me. Then, she confessed that she had been keeping up with me through Facebook. She explained that when she learned about her grandmother's passing, she expected to be contacted by attorneys regarding her inheritance. However, when no one reached out, she decided she needed to contact me directly. She mentioned she wanted to give me time and space to mourn, but she had recently become engaged and was in dire need of funds to help cover the wedding costs. Honestly, it felt like a gut punch. I had hoped that after all these years, my wish for a family would finally come true. However, it turns out she never genuinely cared for me, and the entire situation was a scheme to acquire her inheritance. The most ironic part is that it isn't even her inheritance. Legally, it belongs entirely to me. If only she hadn't treated me so poorly, there's no doubt she'd be the primary, if not exclusive, beneficiary. I've never been obsessed with finances, truly. I own my own home, I don't indulge in any costly pastimes, and I usually get my wardrobe staples from Target. Even if there weren't any discussion regarding the inheritance, I wouldn't have objected to contributing to her wedding expenses at all, if she had approached me respectfully instead of trying to use me, focusing solely on the potential inheritance. All of this was swirling around my mind at the same time. Somehow, I remained calm and inquired whether that was everything she wanted. She immediately became defensive and insisted that the inheritance was secondary, and her real aim was to reconnect with me, and she'd never be able to live with herself if she hadn't tried to get in touch while he was still around. She said she had wanted to contact me for years, but lacked the confidence because she believed I would never forgive her for the sudden eviction, lacking any explanation, and also because her mom had manipulated her. But I could see the anxiety in her expression, showing she was only trying to make me feel better so I'd give her a pass, and I questioned whether the inheritance was her actual motivation. I inquired of my daughter how she learned about the inheritance, and she replied that a few years before the divorce, while she was visiting my mother, my mom disclosed that she wanted my daughter to inherit everything my father, who'd passed away years before, had left, seeing as she was the sole grandchild. I have no brothers or sisters, and back then my marriage was okay, so I understand why my mother would have mentioned that to my daughter. After all, if the divorce hadn't happened, or if my daughter hadn't distanced herself from me for years after, that money would have been hers, just like I previously said. However, the idea that she was solely interested in the financial aspect and giving me false hope truly broke me. I was heartbroken, but I tried my best to hide it. In that moment, I figured that the only way to figure out my daughter's true motives was to gauge her reaction if I told her there was no inheritance at all. I then asked her how much she figured she'd receive from the inheritance, and she gave a pretty accurate estimate. It was clear that she had given this whole thing some serious thought. I then told her that I was sorry to let her down, but that her grandmother had actually left everything to me many years ago, and that I was going to use the money to start my own company, so I couldn't assist her financially. I suggested pitching in for her wedding, putting up a few $1,000s of my own cash to cover some costs. The look of sadness on her face confirmed what I'd been dreading. She told me she was grateful for the offer, but being the only grandchild, she felt entitled to a portion of the inheritance since it was, after all, her grandma's money that was on the table. I explained I wished I could, but my mind was made up, and if the money I offered wasn't enough, there was nothing more I could do. Her face immediately flushed, and she visibly became upset. She pressed me to change my mind again, but I repeated that I was sticking with what I thought was the right thing to do. That's when her true self came out, and she said something that validated all my suspicions about what she really wanted. She said she should have known that I would always be the selfish jerk her mom said I was, and that she was happy I was going through life alone. I looked at her, barely hiding how disgusted I was. Her words stung, but at that point I knew what to anticipate. I just didn't think she'd be so bluntly honest so quickly, that was all. She started to say something else, but I cut her off before she could. I realized then that she was just like her mother, and I understood that the only time she'd contact anyone was when she needed something. I also let her know that leveraging my mourning to try and get her way was repulsive, even for someone like her. She started to speak, but I just burst out laughing and said if she hadn't blocked me years ago, she would have received my messages about her grandmother and possibly gotten most, if not all, of the inheritance. That statement had the desired impact. She appeared completely confused and asked me what I was talking about. I told her to unblock me on her old phone number so I could send all the undelivered texts again. So she did. I forwarded all the messages where I pleaded with her to listen, even informing her that her grandmother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I wanted them to connect before her memory completely faded. This was absolutely accurate, because early on in her illness, my mom talked frequently about my daughter and wanted to see her. I recall how devastating it was that I couldn't make that happen, and now this unappreciative, unkind child had the nerve to ask for money. In my daughter's defense, I'll concede that she looked embarrassed after reading all those messages. She expressed her regret, but claimed that based on those messages, her grandmother would have intended for her to get her portion of the inheritance, and it wasn't right for me to penalize her in this way. She explained that she was inexperienced and ignorant back during the divorce, or else she would have definitely dealt with matters differently. She further stated that she truly desires to mend our connection, and if I was self-centered now, she wouldn't feel at ease continuing to interact with me. I countered that if cash was the deal-breaker for her, perhaps it's best if we just didn't have a relationship. I wanted to believe her when she gave me all that garbage about fixing things between us. I honestly did, but at that moment, I couldn't. I told her that I would consider giving our relationship a second opportunity, but the inheritance was non-negotiable. She glared at me with intense loathing and then departed. I didn't make any attempt to get her to stay. Since then, I've talked to a couple of my friends. Most of them felt I'd done the correct thing. However, one of my closest buddies mentioned that since I didn't actually care about the money, I ought to just dismiss it and let my daughter have some of it, especially if it meant preserving family. I don't concur with this sentiment, but ever since he said that, it's been stuck in my mind. This post garnered far more replies than I anticipated. I truly appreciate everyone's advice and viewpoints. They truly provided me with the outlook I was seeking. Perhaps I should address the most frequently posed query: what were the circumstances surrounding my divorce? It's something I've avoided discussing for a long time, but it probably won't be harmful to talk about it now. My wife and I were married for 23 years. You'd imagine that after such a long commitment, she wouldn't betray my trust, but she definitely did. While I'd rather not go into the specifics, I discovered she was involved in affairs with numerous men. It seemed this had been transpiring for quite some time before I uncovered the truth. The moment I found out, I was absolutely crushed. I didn't know how to bring it up, so I began drinking excessively and having flings with other women. I nearly ruined everything. I had constant arguments with her, and I suppose that combined with the drinking made it simple for her to sway our daughter to support her. After nearly 12 months of living that way and being separated, we finally faced one another and finalized our divorce. As I've mentioned before, it's been incredibly tough that my daughter has completely cut me out of her life. I have to be honest. When I discovered my ex's infidelity, I lost it a bit and wasn't the best father to my daughter. Even while we were separated, and for about a year after the divorce was finalized, I mostly kept to myself and wasn't there for her. However, as soon as I quit drinking and started putting my life back together, the initial thing I did was try to contact her and say I was sorry. Despite that, she wouldn't hear me out and blocked me from everywhere. I was hoping that giving her some space would make a difference and that she'd eventually come around, yet here we are 8 years later, and our relationship has just deteriorated. Now, concerning my mom's inheritance, that's a significant question. Actually, the funds were legally my father's. My grandparents were both physicians and had purchased properties all over the city over the years. Most of those were rentals and ended up generating a considerable amount of income. My dad passed away when I was 21, and he left everything to my mom. Everything remained in her name throughout my marriage, and for a few years after my divorce, while she was still in good health. After my mom died, I was the only heir and inherited everything. My wife didn't receive anything in the divorce, except for alimony until she remarried a few years back, simply because my mom owned everything then. Therefore, based on how things are, my daughter never even had a chance to have anything. I was aware that my grandma was a landlord and possessed a few rental properties on Airbnb, but I never used any of that money, as the income I earned from my previous construction company was more than sufficient for me to live a good life. I believe I've addressed everything you've wanted to know. Plus, my daughter hasn't gotten in touch with me since that incident, and frankly, I don't foresee her doing so. It seems pretty clear to me that her motivation for all this theatrics was solely for the inheritance, and now that's off the table, I don't anticipate her reappearing. I'd be deceiving myself if I claimed that I'm completely unfazed, but at this stage in my life, I've learned not to place too many expectations on others, irrespective of who they are. So that's the end of that chapter, I suppose. I am grateful to everyone who sent their support. It means a lot. I also believe it might be the right moment for me to put myself out there and possibly begin dating again to find some companionship, rather than hoping that figures from my past will resurface. Update number 2. It's been a crazy week, folks. I thought that would be my final and only update, but I guess life had other ideas. Anyways, I had just returned home from my job and was thinking about going out with some friends when I heard the doorbell chime. I wasn't anticipating any visitors, but I opened the door and there she was, my ultimate dread. Her new hairstyle and slimmer figure initially threw me off, so it took a moment to register who she was, although it's tough to completely forget someone you spent so many years with, you know? Seeing her again was a definite surprise, to put it mildly. I was completely tongue-tied, just standing there feeling completely uncomfortable. She proceeded to ask if I had a few minutes to chat about some things. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I didn't want her lingering at my doorstep, so I reluctantly let her inside. The whole situation felt incredibly uncomfortable, as I'm sure you can imagine. We chatted about trivial matters for a bit, and then she mentioned that she understood this was all a little weird, but there were some things she needed to share. I told her to continue, and she explained that our daughter had contacted her about the inheritance. Honestly, I kind of suspected that was the reason. I mean, what other reason would she have for contacting me after all this time? Regardless, she mentioned that she understood the divorce had been tough on me and admitted that she'd perhaps taken things too far. I just chuckled in disbelief, but she didn't acknowledge my reaction. She then stated that I shouldn't let my feelings about her affect my relationship with our daughter. She echoed some sentiments my own daughter has expressed, like how young she was when we divorced and how I couldn't be angry at her for picking her mom over me. I just cut her off right then, saying I don't hold any grudges anymore, and even if I did have some anger, it wouldn't be directed at my daughter. I explained that I was upset to realize, after all this time, she only considered contacting her dad because there was a chance of getting some money. I repeated to her what I'd told my daughter. If she'd had the good sense to try and reconnect sooner, she could have gotten the inheritance. My ex-wife attempted some kind of justification, but I told her my mind was made up, and if they were going to keep rehashing the same thing, it was a waste of everyone's time. I told her I had plans, and if there was nothing else to say, she should probably go. She just nodded and apologized for bothering me, but I told her there was no need for that, and she left. After she walked out, I just sat there, totally stunned. I never figured I'd see her again, let alone have her in my house for a chat. It was a weird experience, bringing up a lot of old memories I'd rather not revisit. I went out with my friends and tried to put it all out of my mind. That's pretty much it. This all just transpired, and I felt like I had to share it because of that. I appreciate it if you are still listening. It's update number 3. I have another update that I wanted to relate. This afternoon, I was at my job when my daughter phoned me. I contemplated not answering, but my inquisitiveness won out, so I accepted the call. I took the call, and right away, I told her if this was about the inheritance, then I didn't see any reason for us to talk. She informed me that there was another topic she wished to discuss. I told her to proceed, and she responded that she'd been giving a lot of consideration to the previous events and felt like she needed to apologize to me. She mentioned she acknowledged that she should have handled everything differently, and if I was ready to pardon her and provide our relationship a second opportunity, then she would be happy to include me in her wedding. Honestly, I was completely shocked, to put it mildly. I inquired if she was certain, and she confirmed that she was and said I could take some time to decide and let her know whether I'd attend. I responded, "All right," and we ended the call. Now I'm truly bewildered. Part of me is absolutely thrilled at the prospect of attending her wedding, but I still can't seem to get rid of the notion that this is just a maneuver for her to get on my good side and perhaps receive the inheritance eventually. On the flip side, if she's truly sincere, I don't want to ruin my opportunity to be a part of her life. If I decline her invitation and she subsequently cuts off contact, I wouldn't hold it against her. Some guidance would be great if anyone has any thoughts to share. Update 4. I've made up my mind and I'm attending the wedding. A lot of you mentioned that attending the wedding wouldn't hurt anything. That seems like a reasonable viewpoint, I suppose. There's no obligation or expectation tied to being invited to this wedding. Also, just to clarify, I'm not a member of the wedding party. I would just be an attendee. That's perfectly okay with me, given that jumping from someone she hasn't talked to in 8 years to someone involved in the ceremony would be quite a stretch. I believe neither of us would be at ease with that situation. I really do hope that this marks the beginning of something new between us, and that we can cultivate something important out of this. I am thankful to all of you for taking the time to listen to my thoughts and for all of the suggestions you've offered. I'm grateful for your support and hope that you'll send good vibes my way.